My survival garden beds are doing great, but the plants won't do well by themselves. They can use some help from me to give me a better harvest. Join me today as I share with you 6 basic survival garden tasks to get that better harvest. Hi, I'm Gardener Scott, and these basic activities are appropriate for any garden. But if you're gardening for the purpose of growing food, as much food as you can, then these basic tasks really can be more important in a survival garden. Some of these are activities that you can do every day. Some you only need to do once a week or maybe even once a month. And as I go through them, I'll give you the reasoning behind it and just exactly how to do it. These eggplants and zucchini are growing great. They have a bright green color. They're putting on growth pretty quickly, and I expect flowers any day now. But they can benefit from the first task, and that's weeding. This is one of those activities that a lot of gardeners get scared off by, but it's really quite simple. I like to keep the area around the plants that I want to grow free of any other plants that might rob them of nutrients or shade them or just get in the way. So for this bed, on a daily basis when I water, if I see a new little plant pop up, I just pull it and drop it on the surface. And by doing this for just a few seconds, I can keep the bed pretty clear. Now, I've allowed some of these plants to grow just to give you some options and to show you other considerations. These zucchini are actually sheltering a lot of plants underneath. The activity is just the same. Pull the plant, drop it on the surface to act as mulch, and clear out the space underneath. Knowing what you are growing is helpful for this because you don't want to pull up any of the plants you're trying to grow. You don't have to have perfect plant identification. You just need to know what you're growing, like these eggplant or these zucchini, and then recognize that everything else is potentially a weed. This plant, I don't know exactly what it is. I think it's a type of sunflower. Doesn't matter. It's not an eggplant. It gets pulled, pulled, pulled. That's an easy way to approach weeding. Don't pull the eggplants or the zucchini and pull everything else. With time and experience and knowing some plant identification, some of these weeds could actually be a food source, which is advantageous in a survival garden. This plant right here is lamb's quarter, very nutritious, and a lot of people really like the taste. The plant behind it is purslane. This is also a wonderful salad crop, loaded with nutrients, edible, and can easily find its way into your kitchen. And so in my typical, normal vegetable garden, I would pull the purslane and the lamb's quarter. But for my survival garden beds, where I'm trying to grow as much food as possible, I'm going to go ahead and leave the purslane and leave the lamb's quarter and then harvest it later on along with everything else in the bed. Because I typically weed almost every day while I'm watering, it's easy to pull up the young weed seedlings and just drop them on the surface to act as mulch. But for beds where maybe the weeds have had more time to grow, I think a different option is advised. Some of these bigger weeds can have a bigger root system, and if we pull them out of the ground, we might disrupt the root systems of the plants nearby, the ones we want to grow. So by taking hand pruners and coming in and cutting off these weed plants at the base, I'm not disrupting any of the other plants that are growing nearby. With the weeding done, the next activity is similar. It's to thin out the plants. The reason we're taking those weeds out is so that they're not competing with our garden plants for sun and nutrients and water. Well, we also don't want the plants themselves competing with each other. If they grow too closely together, you're not going to get the best harvest. So what we do is thin them. We remove some of the plants that are growing too close together. You can see that with this Swiss chard. Ideally, I want at least 6 inches between plants. Here's one plant right here, and what looks to be one clump is actually 3 distinct plants when you move the leaves aside and go down to the base. It's usually a good idea to remove the smallest or weakest plant as you start thinning. Now, these all look pretty good, and actually as I move them aside, it looks like there's even one more back here. So there's 4 plants in this clump. I'll remove the smallest first and just pull it out of the ground. That's this one. Now I have 3 equally sized plants. I'd like to minimize the disturbing of the roots. So I'll come in, I'll loosen the soil a little bit. This one that's the closest to the edge, I'm going to allow this one to stay, and I'll remove these other 2. So with the soil loosened, I'm gently going to separate these plants, trying to retain some soil with these, and then move them to the side. This plant, I'll fill in the holes, and it should recover pretty quickly. Now, these 2 plants are also growing too close together. In this case, I'll go ahead and dig out this entire plant, move about 6 inches to the side, dig a new hole, and then just put it right back into the new hole. It varies by plant, but a lot of these plants you can thin and then transplant or replant as part of the same activity. Some plants may not need to be thinned at all. Those eggplants that we put in as plants with very specific spacing, well, there's no need to thin them. They're already growing at the proper distance. And the same with the squashes and the cucumbers that we only put 1 seed and space them at the right spacing. They don't need to be thinned out. But seeds like the carrots that are sown pretty close together, well, you're going to need to thin those plants so that the carrots that are left behind can grow nice and big and long and give you the harvest you're after. The plants that you just pull out of the ground, like this first Swiss chard, it's probably going to have damaged roots. I can try to replant it, and I will, but I'm allowing that it's probably not going to happen. But these other plants that I dug out, trying to leave the roots as intact as possible, I can definitely replant these in another area with the correct spacing. And that's what I'll do here as well. I'll replant this Swiss chard to allow for a bigger harvest. Now, this row of Swiss chard actually has some more thinning to do, and I'll need to replant some of these plants. I don't have to keep everything in this same bed. In fact, some of these Swiss chard plants, I'm going to move to that bed where I have some open room. So that lone remaining Swiss chard will go in right here. I dug up a pretty big clump of the other chard plants that were nearby. Now, I'll just tease apart these individual plants, and I'll put them in this bed as well. Digging a nice big hole, putting these plants in place, and spreading the Swiss chard to other areas. And here's 2 more actually that were growing close together. I'll separate those out. And so this bed now has Swiss chard. I've modified my plan as I'm gardening. I hadn't planned for Swiss chard in this bed, but now I have it. With the beds weeded and the plants thinned out, we need to make sure that we have mulch on the soil. When the plants are very small, I like to start mulching with dried grass clippings. These are clippings that I actually save through the year. I got this grass last year, but I can definitely use it this year. I also like to use crushed leaves, and these leaves were also collected last year. They make for a great mulch. For bigger plants like these eggplants and one of the chards that I just dug up as part of the thinning, straw is a great mulch to use. Each of the mulches, the straw, the crushed leaves, and the dried grass, can be used by themselves as a mulch, but my favorite vegetable garden mulch is a combination of all three. I mix the straw and the leaves and the dried grass together. In very windy areas like mine, these three different size materials with three different textures really tend to bind together and make it so that this mulch isn't going to blow away in a strong wind. Anytime you weed and disrupt the soil or thin out the plants and attempt to transplant them or mulch, you want to make sure that you water well so that the plants that have been transplanted or that are left behind and might have been disturbed have a better chance of recovering. And so that loose soil flows down around the roots of these stressed plants. The next task to take care of is to trellis the plants. And not all plants need trellising. The trellis is a support for the plant as it grows. I grow vertically, so I can put plants a little bit closer together and allow them to grow up to the top of the trellis and sometimes overflowing it, as opposed to just letting these plants run wild. So these beans right here and these cucumbers will be tied to this trellis as they grow taller. You can see that in this bed of tomatoes. You can see how I have the twine and I connect the tomato plant to the twine. As they grow, they'll reach the top of this tall cattle panel trellis. I do the same thing in this bed where I've got a shorter hoop. The plants aren't going to grow as tall as the tomatoes. For these beans, I'll tie the twine to the top. Nothing fancy, just a double knot to hold it in place. And then I allow the twine to drop down onto the beans. Many of the pole beans that we grow have tendrils, so just dropping a series of these twine pieces into the beans will allow the tendrils to grab on and then climb to the top. For the cucumbers, I tie the twine to this sturdy trellis just like the green beans, but I anchor them to the twine like I do with my tomatoes. I anchor the cucumbers to the twine using these tomato clips. I'll just drop the twine close to the plant and then surround it with a clip. And I'll do this with most of the cucumber plants. As they grow, the tendrils on the plants will grab onto the twine and they'll end up supporting themselves as they grow. The size, the height, and the type of trellis will vary by the plant. The method of trellising, whether you use twine or just weave the plant up through the trellis or maybe clip it, will also vary based on the plant and your preferred method. This is my preferred method. I find it easy, and one of the reasons I like these cattle panel hoops is because they can not only support shade cloth and bird netting and plastic to keep the plants warm, but they're strong enough to support that twine that I like to use as a trellis. The next task may be one of the most important, and that's to actually harvest the food when it's ready. Well, some of these plants, like the zucchini, still have time until they're ready to harvest. Some of these others, like the lettuce and the radishes in particular, are ready now. I put quite a few radishes in here amongst where I was growing the carrots. So by harvesting these radishes that look great, it's kind of like thinning. I intended to harvest these early after the carrots had germinated. And so now, by harvesting these radishes, I'm opening up this space so that those carrots can get more sun and more nutrients and grow better. And as I harvest these radishes, not only are they beautiful, but I can see that left behind are the carrots, and they'll quickly take over this space. And then I'll have to think about thinning the carrots out too. Some of this lettuce is ready to harvest too. Now, I combine a couple things when I harvest lettuce and carrots and radishes. I'll be thinning out this patch as I harvest. So I'll come in here with my pruners and I'll clip out some of the lettuce plants, allowing smaller ones to remain. They'll get bigger and fill in the space. If you only harvest the outer leaves, the inner leaves will continue to grow. If you do this every day with different plants, you should be able to harvest enough lettuce for your dinner and encourage the plant to grow more leaves in the process. Harvesting the plant when it's ready to be harvested is the best way to get the maximum harvest. Now, I know it sounds pretty simple, but this is a problem that many of us have. We get so busy maintaining the garden and growing our plants and not paying attention to when they're ready to harvest that sometimes we're too late. Those radishes couldn't have gone another week. They needed to be harvested right now. If I would have waited, I would have wasted all that effort. The same with this lettuce. It's summer. Every day it's a little hotter, and every day this lettuce is more likely to bolt. And many of our vegetable garden plants will benefit from the harvest. When you start harvesting your green beans, you'll stimulate the plant to grow more green beans. The same with the cucumbers and the tomatoes. Harvest them as soon as they're ready, and you'll get more and more fruit on those plants. And don't forget that you can be flexible in your harvests. This Swiss chard is going to be here through the end of the season. And like the lettuce, all I have to do is peel off some of the stalks, use them, and the plant will keep growing. I can do the same thing with these beets and eat the beet leaves, but I'm primarily growing these beets for the beet root. When those roots have been harvested, just like with the radishes, they'll leave space in the garden. So the next task is to have your seed packets ready. And when you clear out the space in a bed, don't leave it empty. Put something else in its place. This method of putting more seeds in the ground when space opens up is known as succession planting. We have a succession of crops through the growing season, and the choice of the seeds that you use will be determined by the length of your growing season. When this squash is done, I won't have enough time to put more squash in, but I will have time to put in something like radish or spinach or turnips or lettuce that can grow into the cool season. In this area right here, I have Armenian cucumbers. Some of the empty space behind it, I've put more Armenian cucumber seeds after I harvested the radishes that were here. These cucumbers are a few weeks old. They'll give me the cucumbers first. As those plants start to fade, well, the new Armenian cucumber plants will now be big enough to give me more fruit. So I'll have a succession of harvests with these cucumber plants. And when the cucumber plants are totally done, I'll put in some of the cool season plants to carry me into the fall. I might not have enough time to grow more peppers or tomatoes when they start to fade, but it's okay. I have a lot of choices with many other types of plants. I like to keep putting seeds in my vegetable garden, but as you get more experience and you learn how long your season is and how long it takes for some of these plants to grow, you might venture into starting seeds indoors during the summer. So when this squash and these green beans and these cucumbers are faded, it's towards the end of the season, and I might not have enough time to grow a full big spinach plant or maybe some of these types of lettuces. But what I can do with the spinach and the lettuce and the herbs is start them indoors. And then as the weather cools and as these plants fade, I can move those outside to these same beds as transplants and keep the process going. You can expect that you will spend a lot of time and effort on these survival garden tasks, but they don't all happen on the same day. You don't have to do it all at once. If you weed just a little bit every day on a regular basis, well, once you get the mulch down, the weeding is going to drop dramatically. And to the middle and the end of the season, you may not need to weed much at all. Once you start harvesting and encouraging more growth, that's also going to help keep the weeds down because the plants are going to shade the surface, keep it cool, promote their own growth, and eliminate the weeds. Thinning out all of these plants really only happens once. Once you get them into their final spacing, you don't have to worry about thinning out anymore. The same with the trellising. Once you get the trellis set up, and whether you use twine or clips or some other method, you really only have to do that once. As the plants grow taller, you may need to add additional clips or additional support, but the basic task is already done. And the same with the succession planting. Once those seeds are in the ground, you'll need to repeat the process of everything above, but it's pretty simple. You already know how to do it. You've already got a garden growing, and every year you do it, it'll get easier and easier. I'm Gardener Scott. Enjoy gardening.